Man, that's a good way to start a video, with some hacking. That's always a very sexy way to start a video. Is this section from chapter 8 of Kenan Malik's The Meaning of Race, History, and Culture in Western Society. Chapter 8 is titled Universalism, Humanism, and the Discourse of Race. The section that I'm reading here is titled Orientalism and Ahistoricism. So here we go. And the Orientalism in this title is referring to the book Orientalism by Edward Said. In Orientalism, Said argues that Western historians, philologists, and philosophers have fabricated a complex set of representations about the Orient, which for the West have effectively become the Orient. Said suggests that the creation of the Orient in literary, historical, and scholarly accounts established a discourse through which the West could assert political and military control over the Orient. Quote, "My contention is that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormously systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. Moreover, so authoritative a position did Orientalism have that I believe that no one writing, thinking, or acting on the Orient could do so without taking account of the limitations on thought and action imposed by Orientalism. In brief, because of Orientalism, the Orient was not, parenthesis, and is not, in parenthesis, a free subject of thought and action, ... This book, ... also tries to show that European culture gained in strength and identity by setting European culture's self off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self." End quote. Edward Said, Orientalism. One second. There we are. So I have to get to the footnotes, which are endnotes in this piece. And Lord, I hate footnotes. Endnotes. And it's just a citation, so it's okay. For Said, then, Orientalism constitutes a body of thought which both limits how those in the West are able to think about the Orient and allows the West to establish physical power over the Orient. The discourse of Orientalism establishes a dualism between the West and the Orient, which strengthens Western cultures and imprisons cultures of the Orient. This dualism shapes the reality of the Orient for the peoples of both the West and the Orient itself. Despite such major claims, there is, however, a total lack of precision in Said's work as to what he means by, quote, Orientalism, end quote, and what are the historic and epistemic boundaries that delimit it as a discourse. Said himself observes in his introduction that, quote, "By Orientalism I mean several things," end quote. But these, quote, "several things," end quote, are often so contradictory and sometimes mutually exclusive that the term, quote, Orientalism, end quote, is rendered meaningless. Central to Said's argument would seem to be the idea that Orientalism is a post-Enlightenment discourse, the product of the Enlightenment's universalizing categories, and one which allowed the West to establish colonial power over the Orient. Quote, taking the late 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient by making statements about the Orient, authorizing views of the Orient, describing the Orient, by teaching the Orient, settling the Orient, ruling over the Orient. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. End quote. Said Orientalism. But Said also argues that, quote, the demarcation between the Orient and the West, already seems bold by the time of the Iliad, end quote. I can't pronounce these. Aeschylus, the Persians, and Euripides, the Bacchae, quote, Asia speaks through and by virtue of the European imagination, which is dictated, which is depicted as victorious over Asia, that hostile, quote, other, end quote, world beyond the seas, end quote. And Wikipedia says, The Persians is an ancient Greek tragedy written during the classical period by ancient Greece, the classical period of ancient Greece, by the Greek tragedian Aeschylus. How do you say this name?
Aeschylus. Aeschylus. Aeschylus.
Aeschylus. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Aeschylus. The Persians is the second and only surviving part of a now otherwise lost trilogy that won the first prize at the dramatic competitions at Athens City Dionysia Festival in 472 BC, with Pericles serving as Choregos. And the other play was Euripides, the Bacchae. Wikipedia says the Bacchae, also known as the Bacchantes, is an ancient Greek tragedy written by the Athenian playwright Euripides during Euripides' final years in Macedonia at the court of Archelaus I of Macedon. It premiered posthumously at the theater of Dionysus in 405 BC as part of the tetralogy that also included Iphigenia, Aeolus, and Alcmaeon in Corinth, and which Euripides' son or nephew is assumed to have directed. It won first prize in the City Dionysia Festival competition. The Bacchae recounts the Greek myth of King Pentheus of Thebes and his mother Agave, who were punished by the god Dionysus, who was Pentheus' cousin, for rejecting his call. The play opens with Dionysus proclaiming that he has arrived in Thebes with his votaries to avenge the slander repeated by his aunts that he is the son of Zeus. Disguised as a foreign holy man, The god intends to introduce Dionysian rites into the city, but the Thebians reject his divinity and King Pentheus orders his arrest. Eventually, Dionysus drives Pentheus insane, luring him to the mountains. The Bacchae ends with the women of Thebes, driven by Dionysus's orgiastic frenzy, tearing Pentheus apart, while his mother Agave bears his head on a thyrsus to her father Cadmus. Regarded as Euripides' masterpiece, the Bacchae is classified among the greatest ancient tragedies. The Bacchae is distinctive in that the chorus is integrated into the plot, and the god is not a distant presence, but a character in the play, indeed the protagonist. Okay, so back to the text. In Aeschylus's The Persians and Euripides' The Bacchae, quote, Asia speaks through and by virtue of the European imagination, which is depicted as victorious over Asia, that hostile, quote, other, end quote, world beyond the seas, end quote. The two plays, writes Said, distill the distinction between Europe and the Orient, which, quote, will remain essential motifs of European imaginative geography, end quote. Quote, a line is drawn between the two continents. Europe is powerful and articulate. Asia is defeated and distant. It is Europe that articulates the Orient. This articulation of the Orient is the prerogative, not of a puppet master, but of a genuine creator, whose life-giving powers represents, animates, constitutes the otherwise silent and dangerous space beyond familiar boundaries, ... Secondly, there is the motif of the Orient as insinuating danger. Rationality is undermined by Eastern excesses, those mysteriously attractive opposites to what seem to be normal values, end quote. Edward Said, Orientalism. Orientalism now no longer seems to be the specific product of Enlightenment categories, but originates at the very dawn of what Said conceives of as European civilization. Within the earliest of Athenian plays appear the concepts that were to be articulated later by the Enlightenment philosophers. This allows Said to suggest that Orientalism, quote, can accommodate Aeschylus, again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, say, and Victor Hugo, Dante, and Karl Marx, end quote. Edward Said, Orientalism. Any concept of a discourse that can accommodate four writers as historically, politically, and philosophically diverse as Aeschylus, Hugo, Dante, and Marx can but be profoundly ahistoric. The specificities of Aeschylus's understanding of the barbarian, Dante's view of Islam, and Marx's analysis of India disappear beneath the swamp of an all-encompassing, quote, Orientalism. And if the concept of the non-Western world as the, quote, other derives from the universalizing impulse of the Enlightenment, yet is premised on, quote, a line, ... drawn between two continents, end quote, by ancient Greek playwrights and philosophers, in what way is Enlightenment discourse specific to the Enlightenment? Said seems here to posit a view of, quote, Western thought, end quote, essentially untouched since Western thought's creation. The Ahistoricism of Orientalism, the book, leads Said to mimic the very discursive structures against which Said polemicizes. Said creates a, quote, Western tradition, end quote, which runs in an unbroken line from ancient Greeks through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment to modernism. This Said's created, quote, Western tradition is a tradition which defines a coherent Western identity through a specific set of beliefs and values which remain in those beliefs and values' essence unchanged through 2 millennia of European and Western history. This, of course, is the myth of, quote, Western civilization, and, quote, propagated by many an advocate of Western superiority, from Gobineau to Goebbels and beyond. I think Gobineau was like one of the first, one of the big proponents of like modern contemporary anti-Semitism. Arthur de Gobineau lived from 1816 to 1882 and was a French writer and diplomat who is best known for helping introduce scientific race theory and, quote, racial demography, end quote, and for developing the theory of the Aryan master race and Nordicism. Arthur de Gobineau was an elitist who, in the immediate aftermath of the revolutions of 1848, wrote a book called An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races. In An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, Gobineau argued that aristocrats are superior to commoners and that aristocrats possessed more Aryan genetic traits because of less interbreeding with inferior races. Arthur de Gobineau was born into an aristocratic family of counts under the Ancien Regime. Gobineau was ideologically a legitimist who supported royalist rule by the House of Bourbon and opposed the French Revolution, democracy, and rule by the House of Orleans, which came to power after the 1930 July Revolution. Arthur de Gobineau began his diplomatic career in the late 1840s and beginning in 1861 variously served as minister to Persia, Brazil, Greece, and Sweden. As a writer, Gobineau authored novels and short stories, as well as non-fiction travel writings, polemical essays, and other philological and anthropological works, including his essay on the inequality of the human races. His essay on the inequality of the human races is widely discredited as pseudoscience by modern scholarship. Gobineau himself never had any qualifications in anthropology. Although Arthur de Gobineau's writings were poorly received in France, Arthur de Gobineau's writings were quickly praised by white supremacist pro-slavery Americans like Josiah C. Nott and Henry Hotz, who translated Arthur de Gobineau's An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races into English. Josiah C. Nott and Henry Hotz omitted around 1,000 pages of the original book, including those parts that negatively described Americans as a racially mixed population, inspiring a social movement in Germany named Gobinism. Arthur de Gobineau's works were also influential on prominent anti-Semites such as Richard Wagner. Wagner's son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Romanian politician Professor A.C. Kurza, and leaders of the Nazi Party, who later edited and republished his work. Back to the text. In reality, there is no such continuous tradition. The idea that modern Western culture has its roots in Greek learning is, as Martin Bernal has shown, the product of post-Enlightenment Romantic thought. Wikipedia says Martin Bernal, who lived from 1937 to 2013, was a British scholar of modern Chinese political history. Martin Bernal was professor of government and Near Eastern studies at Cornell University. Martin Bernal is best known for his work Black Athena, a well-known controversial work which argues that the culture, language, and political structure of ancient Greece contained substantial influences from Egypt and Syria-Palestine. Back to the text. Footnote. See Martin Bernal's Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization. Published with Free Association Books, 1987. The Wikipedia for Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, published in 1987, Volume 1, 1991, Volume 2, and 2006, Volume 3, is a pseudo-archaeological trilogy by Martin Bernal, proposing an alternative hypothesis on the origins of ancient Greece and classical civilization. Bernal's thesis discusses the perception of ancient Greece in relation to Greece's North African and West Asian neighbors, especially the ancient Egyptians and Phoenicians, who, Bernal believes, colonized ancient Greece, producing the bulk of classical civilization. Bernal proposed that a change in the Western perception of Greece in the 18th century led to a denial of any significant Egyptian and Phoenician influence on ancient Greek civilization. Black Athena has been heavily criticized and rejected by academics. They often highlight the fact that there is no archaeological or historical evidence for ancient Egyptian colonization of mainland Greece or the Aegean Islands. Academic reviews of Bernal's work overwhelmingly reject Bernal's heavy reliance on ancient Greek mythology, speculative assertions, and handling of archaeological, linguistic, and historical data. I don't know how the meaning of that for this, which is just basically saying that the line that just said the idea from Malik that says the idea that modern Western culture has its roots in Greek learning is, as Martin Bernal has shown, the product of post-Enlightenment romantic thought. Now that seems like not what the critiques of Bernal's work is about. But anyway, so it doesn't seem like it threatens the veracity of what Malik is saying here. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily true either. 19th century racial discourse, this is back to Malik. 19th century racial discourse expunged from history the roots of Greek learning in Afro-Asiatic cultures and the Enlightenment's debt to Arab learning, and fabricated instead the myth of an organic, quote, Western tradition from ancient Greece to modern Europe. Said not only accepts the reality of such a tradition, but Said also erases, as Ijaz Ahmad observes, the fractures, conflicts, and divisions within European societies, and treats Europe as a homogeneous maker of history. Quote, it is rather remarkable how constantly and comfortably Said speaks ... of a Europe, or the West, as a self-identical fixed being which has always had an essence and a project, and imagination and a will, and of the, quote, Orient, end quote, as its object, textually, militarily, and so on. Said speaks of the West or Europe as the one that produces that knowledge, the East as the object of that knowledge. In other words, Said seems to posit stable subject-object identities, as well as ontological and epistemological distinctions between the two. In what sense, then, is Said himself not an Orientalist, or at least, as Sadek al-Azam puts it, a, quote, Orientalist in reverse? Said quite justifiably accuses the, quote, Orientalist of essentializing the Orient, but Said's own essentializing of the, quote, West is equally remarkable. In the process, Said, of course, gives us the same, quote, Europe, end quote, unified, self-identical, trans-historical textual, which is always rehearsed for us in the history of literary criticism, which is always rehearsed for us in the sort of literary criticism which traces its own pedigree from Aristotle to T.S. Eliot. End quote. Ijaz Ahmad. I want to look at this person who he referenced. Wikipedia says, I don't know if this is the right person. This is the person who popped up. But I think this is who is being referred to. Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, who lived from 1934 to 2016, was a professor emeritus of modern European philosophy at the University of Damascus in Syria, and was until 2007 a visiting professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, his main area of specialization was the work of German philosopher Immanuel Kant, but Sadiq Jalal al-Azam later placed a greater emphasis upon the Islamic world and the Islamic world's relationship to the West, evidenced by Sadiq Jalal al-Azam's contribution to the Discourse of Orientalism. Al-Azam was also known as a human rights advocate and a champion of intellectual freedom and free speech. And now I want to look up Ijaz Ahmad. Ijaz Ahmad, who lived from 1941 to 2022, was an Indian-born Marxist philosopher, literary theorist, and political commentator. He was the Chancellor's professor at the University of California Irvine School of Humanities, Department of Comparative Literature. Back to the text. Footnote: Ijaz Ahmad, in theory, classes nations literatures. Ijaz Ahmad, in theory, classes nations literatures, is published with Verso, actually. And the description says, after the Second World War, nationalism emerged as the principal expression of resistance to Western imperialism. In a variety of regions from the Indian subcontinent to Africa to parts of Latin America and the Pacific Rim, with the Bandung Conference and the formation of the non-aligned movement, many of Europe's former colonies banded together to form a common bloc aligned with neither the advanced capitalist, quote, First World, nor with the socialist, quote, Second World. In this historical context, the category of, quote, Third World literature, end quote, emerged. A category that has itself spawned a whole industry of scholarly and critical studies, particularly in the metropolitan West, but increasingly in the homelands of the Third World itself. Setting himself against the growing tendency to, quote, to homogenize, quote, Third World, end quote, literature and cultures, Ijaz Ahmad has produced a spirited critique of the major theoretical statements on, quote, colonial discourse and, quote, post-colonialism, dismantling many of the commonplaces and conceits that dominate contemporary cultural criticism, with lengthy considerations of, among others, Frederick Jameson, Edward Said, and the Subaltern Studies Group. In theory, classes, nations, and literatures. also contains brilliant analyses of the concept of Indian literature, of the genealogy of the term, quote, third world, end quote, and of the conditions under which so-called, quote, colonial discourse theory, end quote, emerged in metropolitan intellectual circles. Erudite and lucid, Ahmad's remapping of the terrain of cultural theory is certain to provoke passionate response. Back to the text, end footnote. For Said, a European, by virtue of being European, must necessarily be racist. Quote, every European, end quote, Said writes, quote, in what he could say about the Orient was consequently a racist and imperialist and almost totally ethnocentric, end quote. Said, Orientalism. Every European, surely even Gobineau or Renan, Chamberlain or Knox would have been somewhat more circumspect about making such sweeping statements. As we heard earlier, Renan was an important person who developed a lot of theories about, like a nationalist. Chamberlain obviously had something to do with Richard Wagner's anti-Semitism, and I don't know who this Knox is, but anyway, as Ijaz Ahmad observes, quote, these ways of dismissing entire civilizations as diseased formations are unfortunately too familiar to us who live on the other side of the colonial divide from the history of imperialism itself, end quote. I'm going to repeat that because I like that. Quote, these ways of dismissing entire civilizations as diseased formations are unfortunately far too familiar to us who live on the other side of the colonial divide from the history of imperialism itself, end quote. Ijaz Ahmad. Elsewhere, Said himself has argued cogently against such ahistoric attitudes. Quote, if you know in advance that the African or Iranian or Chinese or Jewish or German experience is fundamentally integral, coherent, separate, and therefore comprehensible only to Africans, Iranians, Chinese, Jews, or Germans, you first of all posit as essential something which I believe is both historically created and the result of interpretation, namely the existence of Africanness, Jewishness, Germanness, or for that matter, Orientalism or Occidentalism, end quote. Said, Culture and Imperialism. Yet such cautionary reminders of the dangers of an unhistorical approach were all too often lost amidst the rush to establish that the categories of Western thought are in and of themselves imbricated with racial thought. A few chapters on from Said's warning against thinking of cultures as, quote, fundamentally integral, coherent, separate, end quote, Said argues that there exists a, quote, fundamental ontological distinction between the West and the rest of the world, end quote, and that, quote, we may consider, end quote, the geographical and cultural boundaries between the West and the West non-Western peripheries, end quote, as, quote, absolute, end quote. Said, Culture and Imperialism. That's the end of this section. Thanks for listening.